A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
The Cold War in the Persian Gulf is effectively over, if there was any doubt about that. Today, March 24th, 2026, marks the official conclusion of the defensive-only era for the major Gulf powers. We have spent years watching Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates build these incredibly expensive high-tech shields, always with the caveat that they would never be the ones to throw the first punch or even host the platform that did. But today's prompt from Daniel is about how that posture has fundamentally shattered following the Iranian escalations we have seen throughout this month. The reversal of base access at King Fahd Air Base today isn't just a logistical change. It is a total realignment of how the United States and the Gulf states operate together.
I am Herman Poppleberry, and I think Daniel is pointing us toward the most significant shift in regional security architecture since the end of the original Gulf War. What we are seeing today with the news out of Taif is the culmination of a pressure cooker that finally blew its lid between March 2nd and March 6th. When you look at the sheer volume of ordnance that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia had to soak up in that 96-hour window, it becomes clear why the diplomatic patience has run out. We are talking about over 1,000 aerial threats in 4 days. That is not a skirmish. That is an attempted saturation of a nation's entire sovereign defense system. It was a stress test of the highest order, and while the shields held, the cost of holding them has changed the political calculus forever.
It is the math of that saturation that fascinates me. We have seen the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Defense reporting that they intercepted 812 drones and 186 ballistic missiles. The success rate is high, but the policy shift we are seeing today suggests that the high success rate is actually the problem. Saudi Arabia just granted the United States access to King Fahd Air Base in Taif for offensive operations against Iran. That is a total reversal of the stance they held even 6 months ago. They have moved from saying, "protect us," to saying, "use our soil to stop the source." This is the MBS Paradox we talked about in episode 1135, the idea that Mohammed bin Salman wants a stable environment for Vision 2030, but he is realizing that stability might require a very loud, very kinetic form of deterrence.
The move to King Fahd Air Base is a direct response to the vulnerability of Prince Sultan Air Base. After repeated drone strikes there throughout early March, the Saudis realized that the digital tripwire model we discussed back in episode 1401 has been triggered. They are no longer content being the anvil. They want to facilitate the hammer. This brings us to the core of Daniel's question about their actual offensive muscle. People often underestimate the Royal Saudi Air Force because of the early struggles in the Yemen conflict, but the fleet they are fielding now, especially the F-15SA, is a different beast entirely. We are talking about 672 combat aircraft in total, which is a staggering amount of concentrated air power for a regional player.
Let's talk about that F-15's AC specifically. They have 149 of them. On paper, it is the most advanced Eagle variant outside of the newer EX models the United States is just now rolling out in bulk. It has the Digital Electronic Warfare System, or DEWS, and the powerful APG-82 Active Electronically Scanned Array Radar. But does having the hardware actually translate to offensive readiness without the United States holding their hand on the logistics side? We have seen them struggle with mid-air refueling and target acquisition in the past, which are the unsexy parts of air warfare that actually win conflicts.
That is where the refinement of the last few years comes in. The Saudis have been running high-tempo operations and focusing heavily on their own domestic logistics chain through the General Authority for Military Industries, or GAMI. But you are right to highlight the difference between them and the United Arab Emirates. The Emirates are often called Little Sparta for a reason. They do not have the hundreds of airframes the Saudis have, but their 78 F-16 Block 60 Desert Falcons are arguably the most capable F-16s ever built. They were actually the first to integrate the internal FLIR and targeting systems that the U.S. Air Force only adopted later. And now they are integrating 80 Dassault Rafale F4 fighters. The Rafale F4 brings a level of sensor fusion and electronic warfare capability through the SPECTRA system that allows them to operate in highly contested environments that might give a standard F-15 pause.
I find the Emirati doctrine much more surgical. They use NATO-certified Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, or JTACs, which effectively means their lethality per airframe is significantly higher. When an Emirati pilot drops a munition, there is a very high probability that the kill chain was verified by a sophisticated ground-to-air link. The Saudis are more about mass and persistence. They have 71 Eurofighter Typhoons as well, which gives them a high-altitude intercept capability that complements the F-15 strike role. But even with all that hardware, we have to look at the defensive side because that is where the real money is being burned right now. The sheer density of the anti-ballistic missile networks in these two countries is unlike anything else on the planet, including Israel or the United States.
The defensive math is terrifying. This is the cost-exchange ratio problem that analysts at Chatham House flagged just 2 weeks ago in their March 26 report. When the Emirates intercepted those 812 drones in early March, the vast majority of those drones were likely Iranian-made Shahed variants, or similar platforms that cost maybe $20,000 to produce. To kill one of those, you are often firing a missile that costs $2 million. Even if you use a lower-tier interceptor like the South Korean KMSAM, which the United Arab Emirates has deployed, you are still spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to negate $20,000. It is an economic war of attrition where the defender is losing even when they win the engagement.
And that is why the Saudi move to open King Fahd Air Base is an economic decision as much as a military one. You cannot win a war of attrition where your shield costs 100 times more than the opponent's sword. The Saudis activated their first THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, battery in July of 25. They have ordered over 700 Patriot PAC-3M SE interceptors. That is an incredible amount of capital tied up in things that explode and disappear the moment they are successful. If you are Riyadh, you are looking at the bill for the March 2nd through 6th campaign and realizing that you could buy a whole new squadron of F-35s for what you just spent on interceptor missiles in 96 hours.
The United Arab Emirates was actually the first foreign operator of THAAD, having it active since 2016. They have built the most dense anti-ballistic missile network on the planet. They are layering THAAD for high-altitude threats, Patriot for the mid-tier, and then they have the Israeli Barak 8 and the South Korean Chongung, 2 for low-altitude cruise missiles and drones. It is a technological marvel. It is the only place in the world where you see American, Israeli, and South Korean systems all plugged into a single integrated air defense architecture. But, as you said, the March campaign proved that even the best shield in the world can be stressed to the breaking point. Intercepting 172 out of 186 ballistic missiles is an incredible 92% success rate, but those 14 missiles that got through did significant damage to infrastructure.
That is the part the headlines often miss. A 92% success rate in a video game is great. In a world of chemical or high-explosive warheads hitting desalination plants or oil terminals, an 8% failure rate is a strategic catastrophe. This is why the rhetoric from the Saudi Foreign Minister, Faisal bin Farhan, has shifted. When he said on March 17th that patience is not unlimited, he was acknowledging that the defensive-only posture is a slow-motion suicide pact. If you just sit there and intercept, you eventually go broke, or you miss a big one. The move to King Fahd Air Base today is the physical manifestation of that limited patience.
If they do join a kinetic conflict against Iran, we have to look at the who behind the what. The intelligence services in these two countries are very different. The Saudi General Intelligence Presidency, or the GIP, led by Khalid bin Ali al-Humaydan, is very focused on the regional proxy networks. They want to know what the Houthis are doing in Yemen or what the militias are doing in Iraq before the missiles ever launch. They have a massive human intelligence network that has been built over decades. But then you have the United Arab Emirates State Security Department, or the SSD, which is almost entirely tech-centric.
The Emirati focus on SIGINT and cyber surveillance is world-class. Tanon bin Zayed Al Nahyan, their national security advisor, has built an apparatus that rivals some of the major Western powers in its ability to monitor digital communications across the Middle East. They are not just looking for proxies, they are looking for the digital signatures of launch commands. If the Saudis provide the human context, the who and the where, the Emirates provide the technical precision, the when and the how. It is a powerful combination, but there is a massive catch, isn't there? We have to talk about the internal friction between these two supposed allies.
You are talking about the Yemen Rift. This is the friction point that could undermine everything. Even though they both face a direct threat from Iran, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are essentially in a cold war of their own over the future of Yemen. Saudi Arabia is still backing the recognized government, while the United Arab Emirates is firmly behind the Southern Transitional Council, or STC. We saw that operational friction turn ugly in Yemen's eastern provinces just this past January of 26. There were reports of Saudi-backed units and STC militias actually engaging in small arms skirmishes over control of key transit routes.
It is a bizarre situation. You have two countries that are essentially integrating their air defense systems to survive Iranian missiles, but on the ground in Yemen, their supporter groups are occasionally pointing guns at each other. It makes me wonder if a full-scale conflict with Iran would actually force them to resolve that rift, or if it would just create more chaos. If Saudi Arabia is launching strikes from King Fahd Air Base, they need a stable rear flank in Yemen. They cannot afford to have the STC and the government forces squabbling over territory while the Houthis are launching drones at Saudi oil fields. It is a strategic nightmare for Khalid bin Salman, the Saudi defense minister, who has to balance the war with Iran against the instability in his own backyard.
The Saudis are betting heavily on domestic stability through GAMI. Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 goal is to localize 50% of defense spending. They actually hit a 24.9% localization rate by the end of 2024, which is impressive given where they started. They are trying to build their own drones, their own light armored vehicles, and their own ammunition. This is about ending the logistical handholding you mentioned earlier. They want to be able to sustain a high-intensity conflict without waiting for a cargo plane from South Carolina to arrive with spare parts. If they can produce their own interceptors, or at least the components for them, the cost-exchange ratio starts to look a little less terrifying.
That localization is key for the long term, but in the short term, the dependency is still there. If we look at the leadership, Khalid bin Salman is the guy who has to manage that relationship with the Pentagon. He is the bridge. He's the one who has to convince Washington that giving the Saudis offensive capabilities won't lead to another humanitarian disaster like we saw in the early years of the Yemen war. But given the March escalations, the appetite in Washington for strategic restraint seems to have vanished. When Iran starts lobbing 1,000 threats at your primary regional partners, the policy of containment has clearly failed. The digital tripwire we discussed in episode 1401 has been tripped, and now we are seeing the kinetic response.
There is also the psychological factor. For decades, the Iranian doctrine was based on the idea that the Gulf states were glass houses that wouldn't dare strike back because their economies are so fragile and dependent on stability. But by hitting the desalination plants and the oil terminals directly in March, Iran may have accidentally shattered the very restraint that kept those glass houses from arming themselves. When you have nothing left to lose because your infrastructure is already being targeted, the defensive-only argument loses its weight. The Saudis and Emiratis are essentially saying, if our house is going to be hit anyway, we might as well throw some stones of our own.
I think we need to address the misconception that these two militaries are just carbon copies of each other. Daniel's prompt asks about their capabilities, and I think it is important to distinguish the Saudi mass model from the Emirati precision model. The Saudis have the numbers. They can lose 10 aircraft and still have a formidable force. If the Emirates lose 10 of those Rafale F4s, that is a significant percentage of their elite strike capability gone. The UAE operates like a scalpel. Saudi Arabia operates like a sledgehammer. In a conflict with Iran, you need both. You need the scalpel to take out the command and control and the SIGINT nodes, and you need the sledgehammer to suppress the mobile missile launchers that Iran hides in the mountains.
The geography of Iran is the biggest challenge for both of them. Iran is a fortress of mountains and underground facilities. Even with the F-15SA's payload capacity, hitting those hardened sites is incredibly difficult without the heaviest bunker busters that the United States usually keeps for itself. This is why the base access at King Fahd is so critical. It allows for shorter sortie times and more loitering capability over the Gulf. If you are flying from Taif, you have a much better angle to approach southern Iran than if you are flying from the coast where you are immediately picked up by Iranian radar. It gives the coalition a tactical depth they simply didn't have when they were restricted to defensive patrols.
So, we have a situation where the hardware is top tier, the intelligence is deep, but divided by different philosophies, and the political will has finally hardened. But the economic attrition remains the elephant in the room. If this turns into a 6-month kinetic exchange, how long can the Saudi and Emirati economies sustain the cost of defense? We mentioned the $2 million Patriot missile. If you have to fire 500 of those a month, you are looking at $1 billion a month just in interceptors. That is not even counting fuel, maintenance, or offensive munitions. Even for oil-rich nations, that is a staggering burn rate that threatens the social contracts of Vision 2030.
That is exactly why I think we are seeing the shift to offensive participation. The only way to stop the economic bleeding is to destroy the launch sites. You cannot win by playing goalie forever. You have to take out the other team's ability to kick the ball. The Gulf states have spent 20 years building the world's most expensive goalie equipment, and they just realized the game doesn't end until they score. The shift we are seeing today, March 24th, is the moment they decided to move their players up the field.
It is a massive gamble for Mohammed bin Salman. His entire Vision 2030 project depends on the Gulf being seen as a safe, stable place for global investment and tourism. If the sky over Riyadh and Dubai becomes a constant battlefield of THAAD interceptions, the global hub dream dies. But then again, if he does nothing and the infrastructure gets leveled, the dream dies anyway. He is choosing the path of active deterrence because the path of passive defense has reached its logical and very expensive conclusion. He is betting that a short, sharp offensive capability will be less damaging to his long-term goals than a never-ending defensive grind.
We should also mention the role of the Presidency of State Security, or PSS, in Saudi Arabia. While the GIP looks outward, the PSS, under Abdulaziz bin Mohammed al-Hawarini, is what keeps the lid on things domestically. In a war scenario, you can bet there will be attempts by Iranian-backed cells to stir up trouble within the eastern province or among the Shia populations in the Gulf. The strength of the internal secret police, the Mabahith, is going to be just as important as the F-15s. If the home front crumbles, the Air Force doesn't matter. The PSS has been preparing for this kind of internal subversion for years, and their surveillance capabilities have reached a level of granularity that is frankly a bit chilling.
The UAE handles that differently. Their state security department is so integrated into the daily life of the country through digital surveillance that they tend to preemptively shut down any dissent or subversion before it even reaches the street. It is a very different atmosphere than the Saudi model, which is more about a heavy physical presence. But both are extremely effective at maintaining internal order, which is something Iran has consistently failed to undermine despite decades of trying. This internal stability is what allows them to even consider an external offensive.
Looking at the takeaways here, the first thing is that base access is the leading indicator. When you see Saudi Arabia opening up King Fahd Air Base to the United States for offensive ops, the red line has been crossed. This isn't just a temporary escalation, it is a fundamental realignment. Secondly, keep an eye on the GAMI localization reports. If the Saudis can get their domestic production of basic munitions and drone parts up to 50%, their ability to stay in a fight without U.S. political approval increases exponentially. That is the real goal of Vision 2030's military wing strategic autonomy.
And the third takeaway is the cost-exchange ratio. If you see the Gulf states moving toward more kinetic responses to drone launches, meaning they start hitting the launch sites rather than just intercepting the drones. It is because the math of the Patriot missile has finally become unsustainable. They are being forced into an offensive posture by the sheer economics of modern drone warfare. It is a fascinating, if terrifying, evolution of the region's security. We are watching the birth of a new kind of regional power, one that is no longer content to wait for a Western rescue.
One thing I'll be watching is whether the UAE and Saudi Arabia can actually bridge that Yemen Rift. If they can't, Iran will always have a backdoor to threaten them. The STC versus the recognized government is more than just a local squabble, it is a structural weakness in the anti-Iran coalition. If they can align their goals in Aden and Marib, then Iran's Ring of Fire strategy, which we talked about in episode 1200, truly starts to fray. But that requires a level of diplomatic compromise that we haven't seen from Riyadh or Abu Dhabi in a long time.
It feels like the digital tripwire has officially become a kinetic tripwire. We've moved past the phase of warnings and entered the phase of consequences. Whether the hardware and the training of the RSAF and the Emirati Air Force are up to the task of a sustained conflict with a motivated adversary like Iran is the big question. But they have spent the last decade and hundreds of billions of dollars preparing for exactly this moment. The F-15s. As they're fueled up, the Rafales are on the tarmac, and the THA-AD batteries are hot.
They have the tools. Now we see if they have the doctrine and the cohesion to use them effectively. The March interception campaign was the stress test. The move to King Fahd is the response. It is a new era in the Gulf, and the old rules of defensive only are buried under 1,000 intercepted drones. The question is no longer if they will fight, but how they will choose to end it.
We should probably wrap it up there. This is a lot to chew on, and I suspect we'll be coming back to this as the deployment at King Fahd scales up. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We couldn't do these deep dives without that infrastructure.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying our explorations of these regional shifts, search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram to get notified the second a new episode drops.
We will see you next time.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We shake.